Are you tired of feeling overwhelmed in social situations? Do you constantly worry about what others are thinking about you? Welcome to the Transformational Peace Podcast, and I'm Dr. Lee. In this episode, we will explore how social anxiety can manifest in various ways, such as fear of judgment, discomfort in social settings, or difficulty engaging in conversations. I will also present some practical strategies to help you navigate the challenges that social anxiety presents. And thank you for clicking on this video, and if it provides you with encouragement, please click the subscribe or follow button below. Also, please share this video with someone who you feel might find this information helpful. Hello friends, thanks for joining me, and today we'll be discussing overcoming social anxiety. Transform your life with these strategies. It's the second semester of your freshman year of college. You've managed to make a few new acquaintances and you just got invited to the party. You finally gotten the courage to go, and on your way a conversation in your head starts. What are the people going to think of me? Will the people like me or not like me? What should I say? What should I not say? What if they don't like me? What if I say something to embarrass myself? Congratulations, the party you were so excited about just became a monster. I call this feeding the monster. And if you've ever experienced anything like this, or perhaps you've had a friend or acquaintance behave like this, there's a possibility that either of you may be experiencing social anxiety. So I want to give you some ideas of how social anxiety works, and let's go through that first. But do me a favor and hang with me through this, because right after, I'm going to explain to you how the pandemic, or COVID-19, affected our lives in terms of anxiety and depression, and consequently social anxiety. Social anxiety is a common mental health condition that can significantly impact an individual's ability to engage in social interactions and daily activities. So let's review some of the hallmarks of social anxiety. Number one, you're self-conscious and have an extreme fear of being judged. You're constantly worried about the way you look or act and what people think of you. Number two, your anxiety feels uncontrollable. Remember, it's normal to feel a little nervous or shy around others, perhaps like when you're starting a new job. However, with social anxiety, it is highly irrational and unmerited. Number three, your greatest fear is that you might embarrass yourself in front of others. And number four, you avoid making phone calls and or texting. It's not that you're afraid of cell phones. You usually have a cell phone on or near you throughout the day. It's again the judgment and opinion that the person calling you may have. And number five, you avoid social gatherings or social situations altogether. And number six, loneliness is the predominant theme, even when you're alone. An interesting point here is if you have social anxiety, you'll feel alone even if you're in a crowd of people. And number seven, you'll experience physical symptoms like other anxiety disorders, which include sweaty palms, trembling and lightheadedness, shortness of breath, and heart palpitations. And number eight, if you've noticed, these symptoms sound similar to a panic attack. However, the difference is if you have social anxiety, you'll only experience the physical symptoms in a social interaction or setting. So before we go into how social anxiety works here, I'd like to notice some important statistics. First, the basics. Social anxiety affects roughly 7.1% of the U.S. population. And recently, the World Health Organization estimated that there was a 25% increase in anxiety and depression worldwide due to the pandemic. Now, this is a very significant increase, and we have to wonder why. And I think the answer might be found in our brain function of neuroplasticity and the trauma response. Neuroplasticity is that part of our brain that allows it to adapt, change, and grow new neural pathways in response to newer, novel situations we're put in. Think of it like your brain rewiring itself. Pretty cool. And hyperarousal is a core symptom of the trauma response, which follows a traumatic event, which the pandemic was for most people. So before the pandemic, our socialization was a reasonably normalized process. And when the pandemic occurred, we basically went into more isolation than we've possibly ever experienced in our lives, which was highly traumatic. How traumatic, you may ask? During lockdown, we may have been unable to see our friends, family, or other people in person. We were also encouraged to stay away from others and maintain distance when outside, also known as social distancing. So our brain took over, thanks to neuroplasticity, and we adapted to this new situation of isolation. In other words, which is a quite normal response, our brain and anxiety levels adjusted to the new normal. Again, an important note here. We are creatures of habit, and we habituated and became accustomed to our new daily lockdown routines, which overrode our prior habits based on socialization. And now, after the pandemic, we have this sudden increase in anxiety. So what happened? Well, we had this extended period of isolation, and all of a sudden, hey, the pandemic's over. And while neuroplasticity is wonderful, while we were in isolation, our brain wasn't able to practice social interaction. This was really important. So most things were reset, and immediately schools reopened. People were going back to their offices, and honestly, I think it was scary and awkward for a lot of people. And here's some further evidence. A recent APA survey in March of 2021 found that 50% of the people surveyed across ethnicities felt uneasy about returning to the in-person interactions. And here's the thing. Our brains didn't get a chance to practice and adjust coming out of isolation. We were socially rusty, and our brains needed this to adapt to the change in socialization. And I think what this has caused was a lower tolerance for social interaction because our brains were taught that being alone and isolated was the new norm, hence the increase in anxiety. In other words, the more our brains get a chance to practice and learn from situations from social activities, our brain gets better at it, and things aren't so anxiety-provoking. So our brain practices and learns and adapts, neuroplastic adaptation, and we get better at doing the hard things socially, and our tolerance for anxiety increases, which I think we're still in the process of currently. Now let's spend some time talking about the three different things that make up anxiety as a whole, which are the physiological, the cognitive, and the behavioral component. And this is important. In order to understand social anxiety, we have to understand anxiety as a whole. And anxiety is essentially a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. So the first is the physiological component, which is how anxiety feels in our body. These are the physical symptoms I discussed earlier, like sweaty palms, shortness of breath, and possible heart palpitations. This is typically considered the most important component of anxiety because it's the one we notice first. Second is the cognitive component of our thought processes. This is the part where if we're experiencing anxiety, we might say things like, I'm really going to embarrass myself. And third is the behavioral component, or our observable behaviors. How this manifests itself if we're experiencing anxiety could be not making or avoiding eye contact or quickly walking away. Typically, all three of these types work together during an anxiety episode or experiencing social anxiety, which intensifies our experience, which furthers our struggle with anxiety. So the typical progression in treatment for anxiety or social anxiety is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. An important note here, this is something you want to do with a trained professional. And I'll give you a brief idea of how this works. What is typically done first is graduated exposure, which is essentially being slowly exposed to the stimulus or thing such that it no longer invokes any anxiety or fear. Second, you can practice by role-playing with your clinician in therapy. This is to give you a chance to practice and test out your anxious beliefs and to determine how false they may be. And third, using CBT is usually, but not necessarily, cognitive restructuring. This is when we are safely allowed to test out our assumptions and beliefs for legitimacy. So I want to talk more about social anxiety and add some additional components to traditional methods like the one I just discussed. When we use methods like CBT, we're implementing clinically what is called a top-down method. This is a very directional flow of perception that begins with the brain. It's the cognitive process that initiates with thoughts which flow down to the senses. In other words, a cognitively directive technique or method. Now, while this method is very useful, when we're experiencing negative thoughts and significant anxiety, we're caught in what I call a thought loop, which is very difficult to break out of, which is why I believe anxiety is so resilient. Think of a thought loop like this. If you tell someone, don't think of a pink penguin, what are they going to think of? A pink penguin. So as opposed to using a top-down method, what if we also incorporated a bottom-up method? This is when we process sensory information to understand how specific stimuli are affecting us. In other words, increasing the awareness of our emotions. So let's think of the thought loop like an inner voice that is extremely difficult to stop. Again, trying not to think of pink penguins. And this thought or thoughts we're repeating over and over in our head only makes our anxiety worse. So intuitively, how do we master that inner voice in order to actively take control of our physiology? Especially in the case of social anxiety, where we're faced with a social situation and our anxiety and discomfort are rising. And what seems useful here is to work from a direction of connection and grounding. We need connection, relationships with others, and need to feel grounded and comfortable with our own abilities. In other words, using our capacity to notice and see what is around us and raise our awareness and connect with the present moment or current environment we find ourselves in. So what if we used all of our capacities, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral, to raise our awareness? In other words, all the suffering isn't in our heads, even though it seems like it. And imagine the possibilities if we paid attention not only to our body language, which is nonverbal, but the body language of others and make eye contact with them. An important note here, research indicates that directly gazing at another person is associated with confidence, interest, and attraction. So instead of saying, I have to avoid anxiety at all possible costs, or the inner voice making your only option to avoid situations that are anxiety-provoking, say to yourself, I'm going to go to the party and it's going to be a crazy mixture of emotions. And here's some evidence to support this. Studies have demonstrated that if a stressor is imposed on two different groups in different ways, where on one group the stressor is imposed involuntarily and in the other group the stressor is accepted voluntarily, each group had a different reaction. The group who receives the stressor involuntarily, in other words, the type of stressor was chosen for them, has a different psychophysiological response, which was to withdraw and be defensively aggressive. The group who voluntarily accepted the stressor, or challenge if you will, exhibited more positive emotion when dealing with the stressor, which could give new meaning to the current vernacular of leaning in. In other words, when we began to experience social anxiety, instead of taking a defensive posture, like the example of the study I just gave, take an offensive posture and choose which stressor you want to address first, which could increase the level of positive emotional experience. And an important thing to remember here is when we're dealing with our anxiety directly and reducing it, we're really not becoming less anxious. In fact, we're becoming more confident and willing to try new things by changing our narrative. So I hope this is helpful for you, and I'll leave some closing thoughts. Remember, one of the big keys in dealing with social anxiety is a tendency to avoid social situations at all possible costs, which in reality increases our anxiety. When you have social anxiety, you're often extremely judgmental and self-conscious, which means you will easily slip into a state of hyper-focus on yourself, the thought looping I talked about earlier, and think that everybody is looking at you, noticing all of your self-perceived deficiencies. And truthfully, other people are not thinking about you. They're typically thinking about themselves and worrying about their own world. These are the cognitive distortions or exaggerations about you that are largely not true. So challenge those cognitive distortions and practice shifting your attention to other people. Make eye contact with them and have a few questions you've prepared in advance, such as, how are they doing? Or how did your week go? The key here is to let go of your hyper-focus on yourself and move your attention to other people. And one little quick note here in closing. Please share your thoughts on what topics you would like to see or hear in the future videos by leaving a comment in the comment section below. Thanks. And remember, surround yourself with positive people who will support you when it rains, not just when it shines. I'm Dr. Lee.